Welcome to There Is a Method to the Madness. My name is Rob Maxwell. I'm an exercise physiologist and personal trainer. I'm the owner of Maxwell's fitness programs, and I've been in business since 1994. The purpose of this podcast is to get to the real deal of what really works, to use science and explain the science so we know what we should do, and most importantly, why we should do it. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the expenses of eating right. I think you're going to be kind of surprised. So let's get into it. But before I do, let me thank Jonathan and Lynn Gilden of the Gilden Group at Realty Pros. They are your people for real estate. They are number one in Volusia County, and Jonathan and Lynn are my go-tos, which I always ask questions of, and they always answer. They're simply the best. 386-451-2412. All right. So energy is energy is energy. I can't state it enough how important it is to understand that when we're talking nutrition, when we're talking exercise, when we're talking fitness, we're talking energy. Energy is always moving around, all right? So I heard this great quote the other day, and what the person said was that it takes far less energy today to get energy than it used to, all right? So what that means is that in the olden days, and, depending on how old you are, I guess would depend on what the olden days are for you. But let's just say 50 years ago, or we can go back way longer than that and go back centuries, it cost a lot of energy to get your food, right? Because remember, I started out saying that energy is energy is energy. So in the olden days, it would take a lot of preparation. And if we go way back into hunter-gatherer days, well, think about the energy that took. You would have to go out and hunt for your food, whether you were a carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore, doesn't really matter. You would still have to hunt, physically hunt for your food. And by the way, if we're going back to those days, and let's just say, well, you're hunting for plant-based foods such as legumes and berries, fine, but just keep in mind you're being hunted as well. So that was going to make sure that you also had to utilize a lot of energy to not become prey, right? A little bit early, but I think you know what I mean by that. So it took a lot of energy to go out and be that hunter-gatherer, right? I mean, you could very likely end up as prey if you really weren't moving quick enough and smart enough, all right? And then, of course, if you were hunting mammals, right, that was also going to require a lot of energy too. So that goes way back. So that's pretty obvious how much energy that took. But let's just go back to even just before the 1970s, which for any Generation Xer or Boomer, no, that's not that long ago, right? We were kids or we were teenagers, whatever, during that time period. So that's really not that long ago. Well, it was in the 1970s, early 1970s, that snacking became a thing. Isn't that crazy to really think about? It is to me. I mean, I was a kid in the 1970s, so snacking was already a part of our life. I mean, we had snack foods in the pantry, which is the whole point of this. But just prior to that, in the 1960s, it really wasn't a thing. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Why? Well, because snack foods, which are ultra-processed foods, just really weren't around prior to that time. So if we go back to the 1970s, then even then it was a little bit, or I should say a lot harder to use energy to get the food that we now can just conveniently get anywhere. So even back then. But now it's really, really bad. I mean, now it is so easy to get neutrally dense food or calorically dense foods in our mouth than it ever has been. It is super, super easy. That wasn't a thing. So even though snacking and, boxed foods and cookies and things like that, candy and candy wrappers and all that were kept on the shelves in the 1970s started to become a thing, it was still a lot harder. And by the way, foods then were actually made a little bit more dense than they are today. So they were a little bit, even those nice little treats were a little bit less palatable than they are today. Foods today are engineered to be as palatable as possible, to get as many calories in your mouth as possible in the shortest amount of time. They didn't quite have all of the commercial nutrition experts available back in those days that they have now. Now it's a huge, huge science. Then it was just a little bit of a science, like everything we progressed, if you want to call it that. So even back then, though, it required more effort. Like you would had to have, and I'm just speaking for myself, get on your bicycle, go to a 7-Eleven and get some snack food. Well, now you don't really even get on your bicycle anymore if you're a kid, right? I mean, it almost seems like those days are done. And I know there's a lot of variables with that, like maybe, the streets are busier. I mean, I get all that. But also it's a matter of we just don't have to move nearly as much as we used to. All right. So what does this have to do with the price? Well, it has everything to do with the price. I'm just trying to lay the foundation to show you how that quote is so freaking true. All right. Never at the point in history have we had to expend as little energy as to get the most energy possible as now. And most likely in the future, it's going to be worse. So because of that, we have the massive obesity epidemic that we have today. Yes, it really can be traced to that. So to give you some finances, just back in the 1970s, around that time period, people were spending 40% of their income on food and groceries. So on food. Now, just 7% of our income is spent on groceries. All right. Now, this isn't to get political and get people all up in arms talking about inflation and how much more groceries are today than they were 5-6 years ago, whatever. Okay, that's not what this is about. This is just giving you the facts that in the 1970s and before, we spent 40% of our income, whatever our income is, on groceries. We bought real food and we didn't buy what we used to buy, right? I mean, or I should say, we didn't buy what we buy now, right? The thought of having that huge car payment being 50% of our income wasn't even on the radar screen. I mean, shoot, we weren't doing that back then, right? As far as automobiles go. We didn't have cell phones bills. We didn't have $600 to $700 iPhones. We didn't have all of these other things that we spend our money on now, such as subscriptions and season tickets and all these kind of things. And I'm not saying any of these things are bad. I mean, I have my share of season tickets and I have my share of subscriptions. I have all of those things. I'm just trying to give you the data and the science that says when we all complain about how much food is now, we're really not understanding that it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. I mean, I saw this thing last night and I actually like this writer for the News Journal. I won't say his name, but I think he's a good writer. And no, I'm not saying I exactly like the News Journal because, hey, I don't. I don't really like much in the case of any newspaper, so it's nothing against them. But he posted an article that said, how has Costco been able to keep their hot dogs at $1.50 all these years? I didn't even read the article because you know what? I don't care. but it's pretty obvious how, right? I mean, crappy food is cheap, right? It's super, super cheap. That's absolutely a fact. So $1.50, I don't even know. Is that that sounds cheap to me, but I don't know what it was 20 years ago. I don't think I was buying hot dogs 20 years ago, unless I was absolutely stuck at a sporting event or something like that. And even then, I just think hot dogs are the most disgusting food ever produced. So I doubt I probably ate any, if hardly any at all. So that is what I'm talking about. $1.50 for a hot dog. Okay. So when people complain, though, about the cost of eating well, I want you to remember the statistic that in the 1970s and before, 40% of your income went to it. Can you say that 40% of your income is going to food now? No way, because you're buying a lot of crappy food. We all do, because it's cheap. Crappy food is cheap. Ultra processed foods are cheap, right? And ultra processed essentially means in a box, in a bag, in a wrapper, more than one ingredient, more than two ingredients, more than three ingredients, ultra processed foods. They're dirt cheap. Now, I get it. I get that some families are on limited incomes. I absolutely get it. But I'm trying to get you to understand that it wasn't that long ago that everybody, in a sense, was on a limited income. In other words, 60% of their expenses were going to other things, mortgage payments, maybe car, I don't know, electricity, all gas, all of that stuff, right? But it wasn't going towards what we put a lot of our money to today. Like, I saw a statistic that said electricity is almost free as far as what it really costs to light up your house, right? So, like, when I was a kid, my dad would blow a gasket if we left lights on in the room and we walked out. He's like, turn the lights off. You don't know how much that's costing me. And that was probably true then. It's not true now. So I'm not saying be wasteful and leave lights on all the time, but the cost of that now is so freaking cheap. When you look at inflation, it hasn't really impacted that bill, right? I mean, maybe your AC bill, but that has nothing to do with electricity. That has to do with how much you're using that AC, because we don't really tolerate warm temperatures very well, right? I mean, I know my electric bill, my power bill is almost 100% of my AC. So to give you an example, like during the winter months, I'm paying well under $100 for my power bill each month at my house. At the gym, we're paying under $30 a month to light it up and maybe use occasional AC during the winter months. That's it. During the summer months, my power bill at my house goes up to $320, and the bill here at the gym goes over $120. So all of it is on the AC. I'm not saying don't use AC. I'm just trying to get you to understand that what used to be expensive in the 1970s, just lighting up your house with electricity, is now dirt cheap. So we spend our money more now on things that we didn't used to spend it on. Well, how about if we took that budget and said, you know what, I'm going to spend 40% on food and maybe look at some of my other expenses and spend less. All right, because then we could eat healthy, right? Then we can go to places and get whole foods, even if they're a little bit more expensive. So if you say, you know, I know oatmeal is good for me, but if I get that organic 100% rolled oats with only one ingredient, you know, that's like $10 a tub. And by the way, I'm making that up. I don't know how much it is, because you know what? When it comes to food, I don't care. I spend my money on good quality food because I know good quality food impacts my health, and health is important to me. So I'm not even really looking at the price, honestly, when I buy food, because eating well to me is a priority. All right. So you can say, all right, so I'm going to spend it on that, right? And then you look at this cereal over here and you go, well, you know, 3 boxes of Fruit Loops I could feed myself on for a week, and it's only, I don't know, $1 a box, $2 a box, $3 a box, whatever it is. It's like, okay, but why not just say I'm going to spend more money on quality food and I'm going to get up to that 40%. I mean, maybe we don't even have to get close to that 40%. I guarantee you we probably couldn't, if we tried, get up to that 40%, right? But if we quit complaining about the price of food now and simply say, I'm going to budget more for quality food, then we are going to realize that the way that impacts our health is so great that we don't care that we're spending 20% more of our income on food and 20% less on crap we really don't need. And that's up to you to determine. But how important is your health to you? Another quote that I heard was that people have a really hard time with cause and effect. And that's why they make really bad food choices. Like, even though we know unhealthy, calorically dense foods really cause our obesity, and obesity causes the number one killer in the United States, which is heart disease, but we still choose to eat bad, shows that for some reason we struggle with cause and effect. The reality is, calorically dense foods, ultra-processed foods with less movement cause obesity. That's a fact, all right? Obesity is linked to heart disease. Heart disease kills, all right? So if you were really able to take that cause and effect and let it sink in, that every time you are choosing to eat that ultra-processed food, that you really are choosing to be killed by a heart attack, I think you would make other choices. But for some reason, we struggle with cause and effect, all right? So for example, again, not to get political. If you get political, you're an idiot, because that's not what I'm saying, all right? But let's just say, everybody talks about gun violence, and it's like, okay, so like guns are going to do this, guns are going to do that. And so what do people do? They go out to protect themselves because they're afraid they're going to get killed by a gun. So they go get a gun so they don't get killed by a gun. And the chances of you getting killed by a gun is so minuscule. And no, I'm not downplaying what happens of people who are victims of violent crimes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people who really don't understand cause and effect very well, all right? Meaning that they get a gun to protect themselves from getting killed by a gun. Okay, the chances of that is so rare compared to the chances of you getting killed by a heart attack, that what if you put that same cause and effect energy into your food choices? And again, this isn't political. I don't care if you arm yourself and all that kind of stuff. But why is it when you arm yourself because you're afraid of getting killed by a gun, you're also not afraid of getting killed by a heart attack, which is far more likely, and also preventable, right? You can choose to eat better and hope that everything else goes your way, but at least you have a choice to eat better, which we do know has an impact on heart disease, all right? And whole point of this podcast was to give you some numbers, because that's the method to the madness. So now that we know that when we say it's expensive to eat healthy, that is a made up myth. No, it's not. Our parents were able to survive on 40% of their income going, well, maybe not your parents. My parents, because I'm a Gen Xer, could afford to spend 40% on their income on food and still get by and raise us and my 5 sisters. It was very possible. We have a big family to raise me and my 5 sisters. So it was very, very, very possible to do so. All right. So that's a made up myth. All right. Only 7% goes to it today. What's the other percent going to? I don't know. Maybe you can look at that and really start to prioritize your health. All right. Just like we want to prioritize our garage doors, don't buy junk. Don't buy bad services. Buy Overhead Door. They're simply the best. I vouch for Jeff and Zach Hawk, the owners. They are absolute great individuals. And if you need any help, give them a shout at overheaddordaytona.com.